So when it comes to the whole why NASA never returned to the moon theories, I find these type of videos rather interesting. At the same time, I know that I have to take the information given with a grain of salt. You know what I'm saying? Because it's countless conspiracy theories out there. You know what I mean? And it's up to us to sort through and sift through all of the information given. So that's what I be doing when I be checking these videos out. You get what I'm saying? So we're going to check out this one, all right? So if you're new, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button, join the fam, and let's see what they talking about.
The Apollo 11 moon landing is one of the greatest man-made achievements of modern science, but no matter how much it's been reported on, you don't know it all. These are 20 secrets about the Apollo 11 moon landing. Number 20. Saturn V still holds decades-old records. Saturn V was NASA's super heavy lift launch vehicle that they used to explore the moon under the Apollo program. It was a human-rated rocket with 3 stages and gained its power from liquid fuel. This launch vehicle was flown from 1967 until 1973, and in that time was relied on for 9 crewed flights to the moon. It was also used to launch Skylab, the first American space station. You might look at Saturn V and go, oh, that's old tech now. But you might be surprised to learn that this super heavy lift launch vehicle still holds records it set all those many moons ago.
I was not saying that at all. I was sitting there looking at it, getting ready to launch, and I was like, yo, look at all that thrust, look at all that power, look at all that. Like, I was just in awe of that. I wasn't at once saying it was old. Never that.
Heavy lift launch vehicle still holds records it set all those many moons ago, pardon the pun. As of 2022, it's still the only launch vehicle to have carried humans below low Earth orbit, which is a pretty impressive feat. It also holds records for launching the heaviest and largest payload capacity to low Earth orbit, which was 140,000 kilograms or 310,000 pounds. This weight included the 3rd stage and unburned fuel, allowing it to send the lunar module and Apollo command and service module to the moon. So even though this rocket is now ancient, it doesn't appear like any others will be taking those records from Saturn V anytime soon. Like this video, smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell right now, or this centipede will crawl on your face when you're sleeping. Now, it's time for the odd topic. This is why NASA never returned to the moon. It was covered in bees. No, that's a joke, but there is a reason. This photo. This is the reason. The photo, which was apparently taken in secret and kept from the public, seems to show alien creatures. The rumors are that the astronauts from the Apollo mission came across one of these things and even managed to communicate.
That looks so Photoshopped, like so horribly Photoshopped, bro. Come on, man. That's why I say, remember, grain of salt
with it. As always, let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below using the hashtag OddTopic. Number 19. Bacon was the first meal on the moon. If someone ever tries to tell you that you shouldn't eat bacon because it's bad for you, just remind them that if it's good enough for astronauts, it's good enough for you. Bacon was among the first food types eaten on the moon, and I can think of nothing better to snack on when you're celebrating a momentous achievement. Well, maybe a congratulations cake or something, but yeah, bacon's pretty.
Like, come on, your first time to the moon, and I'm still waiting to hear some more reasons of why they never returned to the moon, but your first time, you want bacon? Nah, bro, give me a steak. I want to say I ate a huge, like, tomahawk steak on the moon, bro. What?
High up on the list. It's not known if it's coincidental or not, but bacon cubes were one of the meals stored in the lunar module, and they were meal A on the schedule, meaning they were the first thing to be eaten after landing. Alongside bacon squares, the astronauts also tucked into refreshing peaches, delicious sugar cookie cubes, a thirst-quenching pineapple and grapefruit drink, and coffee. According to some reports, the astronauts ate this meal ahead of schedule once they landed at the Sea of Tranquility. By this point, bacon was already a firm favorite within the American space program, and it had appeared in early Gemini missions. However, things have changed at NASA, and now bacon is no longer offered. Ugh. The closest thing to bacon they enjoy now is freeze-dried sausage patties that they have to rehydrate with hot water. Number 18. The moon landing launch was protested. NASA has been around for quite some time now, and they've got some pretty costly gear. Since it first became a thing, the United States has spent close to $650 billion on NASA. They also enjoyed a generous 2020 financial...
That's expected. It's still a high number to hear, though. That's an incredibly large number. But for what we're trying to accomplish and do, yes, that's expected. But it still is crazy when you hear it.
$650 billion on NASA. They also enjoyed a generous 2020 financial year budget of $22.6 billion and spent about $25 billion in the 1960s on the Apollo program. When you see just how many people have been and are struggling financially in the United States, it's hard not to picture how many people's lives could be changed by that money. And that's probably why hundreds of people turned up to protest the rocket launch a few days before it set off. Around 500 protesters, mostly African Americans, visited the gates of the Kennedy Space Center with civil rights leader Ralph Abernathy carting 2 mules and a wooden wagon. They did this to show the contrast between the Saturn V rocket and those who couldn't even afford food to eat or have somewhere safe or comfortable to live. They were protesting that there were plenty of other pressing needs that required funding, and they weren't wrong. Even a former historian at NASA told Space.com that he thought the civil rights leader had a really good point about misplaced priorities. Number 17. A musician wrote a song about opposing the moon landing. Gilbert Scott Heron was a musician, author, and American soul and jazz poet. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, he was known mainly for his spoken word performances, and one in particular was more well known than others. Gilbert wrote a spoken word poem in 1970 called Whitey on the Moon, which he released on his debut album called Small Talk at 125th and Lenox. The poem was recorded over drums and described medical debt, poverty, and high taxes that people were experiencing while the Apollo moon landings were happening. Gilbert wasn't afraid to dish out criticism in the poem, especially regarding how many resources were spent on the Apollo program, while social and economic disparities were a massive problem in Black American communities. The piece became quite popular with many African Americans in inner-city neighborhoods across Los Angeles, Detroit, and New York, especially with those directly impacted. Even though
now I can understand why a lot of people have those feelings and different things like that. And for me, I was once in that position too, because for me, and I'm only speaking for me, it was lack of information. You know what I'm saying? When you don't know, you assume things. So I assumed that instead of them putting money into space and everything, they could help us out down here, hunger and all kind of different things that's going on. But at the same time, now that I'm much more conscious and aware of what the money is going to and what we are discovering and how it does help us, and you just seen us just take out an asteroid, what we're learning and what it could mean for our planet and different things like that, the information of why these volcanoes could start happening or are happening, and that we find out underground, bacteria being underground and what it means. Like, we've discovered so much information, but I didn't know that. You know what I mean? And it was my fault. I wasn't looking for that information. So I can understand why somebody would feel that way. You know what I'm saying? That they don't have the information.
Though it was written so many years ago, it's still talked about and listened to today. It featured in the biographical film about Neil Armstrong in 2018 titled Neil Armstrong, First Man, and you might also notice it in the second episode of Lovecraft Country. Gilbert Scott Heron died in 2011 and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2021. Number 16. The Apollo astronauts had no bathroom. You might assume that a bathroom aboard a space shuttle would be similar to those on airplanes. After all, it can sometimes feel like you're gonna get sucked out of the plane through the toilet, and it probably feels a bit like that in space, too. But did you know that Apollo astronauts didn't even have a bathroom? No, it seemed like NASA were so focused on getting the astronauts into space and up to the moon that they didn't give much thought into how astronauts would be able to empty their bladders and bowels. And their lack of planning caused immediate problems. Astronaut Alan Shepard had to pee his pants on the launch pad in 1961. He piloted the first human spaceflight, which was only supposed to last for around 15 minutes. However, he had to sit on the launch pad for quite some time, and he desperately needed to go. The only option was to pee in his seat. After that awkward moment, NASA started developing urination equipment. To be honest, it probably wasn't much better than peeing yourself. They made something called roll-on cuffs that looked like condoms and weren't all that suitable for women. Next, they made bags that astronauts could tape to their butts. Once they had finished their business, they had to add a liquid bactericide to it and knead their poop like bread to stabilize it. Luckily, things are a little bit more comfortable and refined now. Number 15. Neil Armstrong almost died before walking on the moon. Isn't it weird to think that Neil Armstrong almost didn't make it to the moon? You have to remember that to even get to the moon in the first place, they had to undertake a whole host of different training exercises and tests, and not all of these were safe. Just 14 months before Apollo 11, Neil was conducting a test flight in a lunar landing training vehicle, which, as it turns out, is quite a dangerous unit. Something doesn't go as planned, and the training vehicle malfunctions. But his reaction to what happened was very much like Neil, according to Alan Bean, Neil's office mate from the Manned Spacecraft Center. Alan said to Neil, "I heard you went out of control and you ejected, barely made it." Neil then casually went back to work as if he didn't almost die. Number 14. Alarm codes flashed before landing. Landing on the moon for the first time would be scary enough without anything going wrong. So imagine when something does. Your heart would be in your mouth. When Apollo 11 was getting ready to land on the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin noticed something on their navigational computer, and it wasn't good. The computer flashed a 1202 alarm, which meant that something was wrong. As the astronauts hadn't memorized all the alarm codes and what they meant, they had to radio back down to mission control to find out what was happening and determine if aborting the landing was a possibility. But it's not like the moon landing trip was planned on a whim. Mission Control had thought of everything during their Earth simulations, including all possible codes that might show up. Fortunately, a 1202 alarm just meant that the computer was overloaded. Mission Control said they would be good to go if the alarm cleared.
But what would they have done if it had been like, we can't land. One of them codes meant something's wrong with it. We need to turn around and go back. You're that close to the moon. What are y'all doing? Are y'all still landing anyway and taking your chances, or what are you doing? I'm going back. But I know some people would be like, yo, this is like a once in a lifetime opportunity. I'm taking it, and whatever happens, happens. Some people would do that. I want to know.
And even though similar alarms reappeared later, the mission went ahead. According to experts, that particular alarm code meant that the computer was being loaded with too many commands, and memory space was running low. This was important because the wording indicated that the computer wouldn't be able to make all the necessary calculations. But all's well that ends well. The computer system was designed to drop processes in order of least to most critical if this very situation happened. Number 13. Low fuel. When your fuel light comes on in your car, you usually don't panic. Not unless, of course, you're nowhere near a gas station. But the fuel light coming on in a space shuttle? Now that's reason to panic. Yes. When the Apollo 11 lunar module was on its infamous descent, the fuel light flashed on. At that point, they were still about 100 feet above the ground on their way to the moon, and the tank was almost bone dry. Buzz Aldrin said he held his tongue when the light came on, and communicator Charlie Duke from NASA connected with Neil and Buzz from Houston to tell them they had just 60 seconds to come back down. Buzz didn't want to tell Neil to hurry up, but there was definitely a sense of urgency. They had to guide the lunar module down carefully, but also quite quickly. They managed to drop down about 90 feet in 30 seconds, which meant they just had 30 seconds left for the last 10 feet to the moon's surface. According to Buzz, he estimates that they had about 15 seconds of fuel left, and it really seems like they made it by the skin of their teeth. Imagine if they had crash landed on the moon. They'd probably be stuck there for good.
I know everybody at the control center, like back at the control center for NASA, I know they had to be like on blood pressure medicine. Fam, all the issues that arise, the alarms, the fuel, the what, you know what I'm saying? Like you sitting there and you just so tense.
Number 12. The dangers of moon dust weren't known. How can you build a spacecraft for a successful landing without actually knowing what the terrain you're landing on will be like? It seems impossible. The ground beneath Tranquility Base did look like it was free of boulders and obstacles that would damage the lunar module upon landing, but there was no guaranteeing anything. There was also no guarantees that the moon dust they'd be landing on was stable and that they wouldn't just sink into it like quicksand. Their fears were pretty warranted, because that moon dust was pretty nasty stuff. Several astronauts have even called it the #1 environmental problem on the moon. There's no way to simulate its grittiness on Earth, and it caused problems with everything they did. Just walking on the moon stirs up dust, and the rovers also stir up a lot of dust. Astronauts have also said that it travels ballistically and sticks to anything and everything. The frustrating moon dust would also smear across the faceplates of their helmets, causing scratches that affected their vision. It even infiltrated the fabric layers of their suits, got stuck inside zips, and ruined cameras. It also managed to get into sealed containers. Moon rocks were brought back to Earth inside specially constructed boxes with seals, and dust still got in. Number 11. Buzz Aldrin would have been the first man on the moon. It was standard practice for junior crew members to leave the spacecraft first on most moonwalks. That way, the most senior and experienced crew members would remain inside and have command of the controls if something were to happen. But that didn't happen during the Apollo 11 moon landing. As we know, Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon, and he held the most senior ranking. Neil was the Apollo 11 commander, while Buzz Aldrin was the lunar module pilot, and Michael Collins was the command module pilot. Buzz Aldrin said that having the commander be the first man to walk on the moon was all about symbolism, and NASA had organized for Neil to have the honor rather than the more junior members. So Neil climbed down the ladder and walked on the moon, followed by Buzz about 20 seconds later. Well, that's the story we've been told, but NASA's version of events on their history website actually differs. According to the piece on Apollo expeditions to the moon, the agency had planned for Buzz to walk on the moon first, but the design of the lunar module made that challenging. The hatch opened opposite to where Buzz was sitting, which meant that he would have to climb over Neil in his bulky suit. They tried this movement in training, and it damaged the lunar module mock-up. Number 10. Michael Collins stayed in lunar orbit. The sad reality is that we know the names Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin more than we know the name Michael Collins. But he was on the Apollo 11 mission too. While Neil and Buzz explored the surface of the moon, Michael stayed in the command module. For a moment, it was almost like the world had just forgotten that Michael was even there. He was even later described as the loneliest man in history, while his colleagues walked on the moon without him. But when the crew returned safely, spent 3 weeks in quarantine, and commenced tours, it did become apparent that the general public cared for Michael and his success just as much. People knew that they were a 3-man crew and that what they did was truly remarkable. Michael Collins, who also flew on the Gemini 10 mission, died in April of 2021, and NASA wrote quite a nice profile piece about him on their website. They described him as a true pioneer, a lifelong advocate for exploration, and a tireless promoter of space. His family said that Michael had always faced life challenges with grace and humility. Number 9. Buzz and Neil stayed on the moon for 21 hours and 36 minutes. Have you ever wondered what Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong did once they got to the moon and how much time they spent there? Well, you're about to find out. They stayed on the moon for 21 hours and 36 minutes, with most of that time spent inside the lunar module. Once they landed on the lunar surface, they hung around in the lunar module for about 4.5 hours before finally making their way out. Once on the moon, they collected samples, planted the American flag and a plaque, took videos and pictures, and took a call from the White House. They also set up some experiments and placed goodwill messages from 73 countries on the moon, along with commemorative medallions with the names of astronauts and cosmonauts who died before the moon landing took place. This all took around 2.5 hours, and after that time, they ventured back into the lunar module to get some sleep. Finally, they made their way back to Earth. Number 8.
I'm surprised they didn't try to bury something. You know what I mean? Like something like a time capsule or something. I don't know. I'm doing everything that I can with that opportunity.
10 prevented a disaster. There was every possibility that the Apollo 11 mission could have ended in disaster if it weren't for the astronauts having access to what turned out to be a critical pen. After Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had been collecting samples on the surface of the moon for almost 3 hours, they decided to make their way back into the lunar module. But as they were climbing back in to head back home, the life support backpack on Buzz's suit hit the circuit breaker switch. According to Neil, the suits are cumbersome and you feel like a Frankenstein monster wearing a big backpack on your back. The switch played a pretty important role in their journey home as it activates the ascent engine, which lifts them from the moon. Neil said Buzz could have picked something far less critical to hit accidentally. It was unlikely that the circuit breaker would trip when they lifted off, but they needed a bit of assurance. By this stage, they had already gotten rid of most of their tools to lighten the load, so they had to think on their feet about what they could use to solve the issue. What they had left was a pen, and they used this to engage the circuit breaker and trigger the engine. The pen was created by Duro Marker, and it's designed to function in extreme temperatures, underwater, and weightless environments. Astronauts still use this pen today, and the original used by Buzz and Neil is in the Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington. Number 7. President Nixon prepared a speech in case the astronauts died. NASA knew that sending people to the moon was a risk. They had done as much preparation and planning as possible, but there was always that chance, and a pretty high one actually, that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin wouldn't make it back.
And I get that, but I don't even know how I would feel about you already preparing the speech. How about let it happen and then you prepare the speech? Don't put it out there. I'm a person that I don't want that out there. No, don't do that. No. I'd have been heated, bro. I'd have been heated.
Failure to launch from the surface of the moon could mean that communications would be turned off and the men would have to starve to death or kill themselves. Didn't bear thinking about, but that was the reality. And it was a reality that President Nixon was actually told to prepare for. His speechwriter, William Safire, created a backup speech in case the moon landing wasn't the success that it ended up being. It was released to the public 30 years later and was quite haunting. The speech started with, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace," and bore spine-tingling statements like, "They will be mourned by their families and friends. They will be mourned by their nation. They will be mourned by the people of the world. They will be mourned by a Mother Earth that dared send 2 of her sons into the unknown." Ugh. It's intriguing because most of us have never thought about an alternative outcome to the one that we had. But imagine if that really was the outcome. Would we have gone back since? Number 6. Thunderstorms almost ended the mission. Many things nearly caused the Apollo 11 mission to fail, but did you know that a US Air Force meteorologist pretty much helped save their lives when they returned to Earth? The meteorologist, Hank Brandley, noticed active thunderstorms in the area where the spacecraft would be performing its splash landing in just 3 days. The storms he saw contained winds at high altitudes, and he was concerned that if the capsule dropped into that exact location, those strong winds could shred the capsule's parachutes. These parachutes were important for slowing the capsule down for a more manageable landing in the water. Without them, it would travel too quickly and the astronauts would likely die. But Hank had another issue. He was using top-secret weather satellites that he worked with to learn this information, so he had to go through high-level officers just to make sure NASA could be told about the dangers they faced. Fortunately, they were made aware of the threat and changed the spaceship's flight path to avoid the storm. Subsequently, Apollo 11 touched down safely in the Pacific Ocean, away from the storms that might have led to a very different outcome. Number 5. The service module almost killed the astronauts. Spaceships are complicated, but allow me to explain how the service module of the Apollo 11 mission almost killed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. The astronauts were traveling in a 2-part spacecraft that consisted of a command module and a service module. Together, they were called CSM. The CSM also had a third part known as the lunar module, which the CSM delivered to the lunar orbit. The astronauts took that lander to and from the moon's surface while Michael Collins stayed in orbit. The CSM would then take them all back to Earth. Just 15 minutes before they were due to splash into the Pacific Ocean, the CSM separated into its 2 parts, as it was supposed to do. The astronauts were in the command module because it had a heat shield to protect them from the scorching energies created by traveling at 25,000 miles an hour. By this point, the service module is useless, so it was supposed to skip off the Earth's atmosphere to stop it from becoming a collision risk. Instead, it chased the astronauts as they descended. The astronauts described its location to Mission Control, but they weren't able to offer any more details as radio communications cut out at a planned time. Luckily, they never collided with the module, but an electrical engineer for the Apollo program said that it should have been nowhere near the command module when it descended. Number 4.
Close.
The astronauts had to quarantine. Most of us now don't blink an eye when we hear words like quarantine and isolation. COVID-19 has made us quite tired. But even back in the late 1960s, the astronauts had to spend nearly 3 weeks in quarantine just in case they contracted some kind of moon plague. NASA couldn't be sure that the astronauts wouldn't bring back microorganisms or pieces of dust that could impact life on Earth. Imagine starting a lunar plague. It'd be a nightmare. So just in case, the crew was quarantined for 3 weeks before they could make any kind of public appearances.
That's cool, but that thing looked kind of small. I'm gonna need for them to have us a quarantine like mansion, like 3 weeks, bro. Come on.
First, NASA only thought about setting up a clean room to handle lunar samples in a vacuum, but they started realizing the astronauts themselves could pose a risk.
Yes, sir. The council communicators have been giving us daily news reports. Yeah.
Scientists didn't really believe there were germs on the moon, but they couldn't be 100% sure. And to make sure they could identify whether illnesses were terrestrial or lunar, they set up a 3-week quarantine before they left as well. This would mean that if they developed a sniffle before they left, they could say with 100% certainty that it came from the Earth and not the moon. Number 3. The astronauts had to sign customs forms to declare moon samples. Customs declaration forms are pretty standard on airplanes. Each country you enter wants to ensure you aren't bringing anything with you that you shouldn't, like food, soil, plants, and animals. But imagine being required to fill out a customs form after returning from space. After landing in Honolulu, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and Neil Armstrong actually had to. They typed their flight number in as Apollo 11 and listed their departure point as the moon. Their arrival destination was outlined as Honolulu, Hawaii, USA. Under the section about the items they acquired on their trip, they listed moon rock and moon dust samples. Hilariously, under the Declaration of Health section, which asks travelers to list any condition on board that might lead to the spread of disease, they wrote, "To be determined."
I would have wanted a copy of that customs form, bro. Like, how many opportunities you get to write from and put the moon in the from area? You know what I'm saying? Back to Earth. I would have needed a copy of that just for me to have hung up somewhere in my house. Like, you're supposed to frame that. I'm sorry.
Number 2. The Historic Mission Control Center was restored. The Historic Mission Control Center at NASA's Johnson Space Center is an integral part of history, and the people working within it are just as important. They were responsible for safely launching people into space, and they did so with some pretty basic technologies from the 1960s till the early 1990s. The Historic Mission Control Center was used for planning, monitoring, and commanding controls, and it became pivotal for several manned spaceflight missions like Gemini, Mercury, Apollo, Soyuz, and Shuttle-era missions of the 1990s. After years of use and increased foot traffic, it received a threatened status in 2015. The decision was then made to restore it, with work starting in 2013 and a goal to finish it by 2019. The goal was to restore it to its Apollo-era condition, meaning it would have all original consoles used for all missions, as well as the same original carpet, upholstery, wallpapers, and seats, which would need to be made new and replicated. Number 1. Millions of people still think the moon landing is a hoax.
A lot of people do.
Do you think the moon landing is a hoax even after everything you've just learned? Maybe not, but polls have shown that at least 6% of Americans believe it was. Millions of people think that the mission was an elaborate hoax produced at the Area 51 Air Force testing range in Nevada, or possibly even a Hollywood movie set. Believe it or not, it took a whole year for people to start thinking it wasn't real, and it all started with the Vietnam War when Americans started questioning the government. And they rely on a few different pieces of alleged evidence to believe it's a hoax. Firstly, they say that the flag Neil Armstrong planted on the moon couldn't ripple because, well, there's no air on the moon. Although the astronauts actually bent the metal frame holding the flag, which caused the ripples. They also say that there are no stars in the background of the photos taken on the moon, but the cameras just couldn't capture their faint light. Hilariously, when a conspiracy theorist challenged Buzz Aldrin, Buzz punched him in the face. Apollo 11 was a pretty big deal back in 1969, and it remains a pretty big deal today since we haven't been back to land on the moon since. Were you aware of all these crazy facts about the mission? Can you think of any others? Also, check out our other cool stuff.
I don't think you'll ever have everyone fully convinced that it actually took place. You just won't. But I'm still upset about the president writing that. You know what I mean? I would have been, that's something they shouldn't have. If that were me, I wouldn't have wanted to know. No. Because for me, it's putting it in the air. And don't put that in the air when I'm trying to do something like that. No, that bothers me. And you can tell it's bothering me. But anyway, man, y'all get at me and let me know what you thought of this video. And stick around and stay tuned, man. Until next one, I'm gone. Peace.